Joining us now, national security analyst for NBC News and MSNBC, Clint Watts. Clint, good morning. It's good to see you. Let you take us through the board. Conflicting reports about what's happening again today at that steel factory in Mariupol. Russia says some humanitarian corridors are open, and yet they continue to bomb the steel factory. What are you seeing there on your map?
Yeah, several things happening right now, Willie. No real Russian advances yesterday of significance other than trying to go into the steel factory. Separately, I'm going to go in blue today to sort of show what the Ukrainians have been able to achieve. They've gone 40 kilometers here into what essentially was that surrounding area around Kharkiv. Kharkiv was under intense bombing from the first days of the war. As the Ukrainians push them out here in this area, you're starting to see less artillery is going to be dropped. They just can't do it very precisely. Separately, in this entire area here, you're starting to see Ukrainian military defenses built up, and you're seeing Russian forces probing on many different axes. You're also going to see the Ukrainians trying to defend here. Now, separately, when we zoom in and look a little bit closer, several key things are happening. One, let me see if I can get this pulled up. Let me go to the east. One, here what you're seeing is the Russians trying to advance on several different fronts. So in each of these axes here where you see the light blue, the Ukrainian military building up defensive positions, essentially blocking them off. But what you're really seeing here is the Ukrainian military pushing for this corridor into Izium. Separately, each of these advances here, you'll notice that they're almost just straight lines across the board here. What you're seeing essentially is on this board, you're seeing them try and encircle this area here. This is Western Donbass. If they can bring each of these corridors together, the Russians will have success, but they have not been able to do that. That report that you saw about U.S. intelligence essentially possibly helping the Russian military or the Ukrainian military target the Russian military. Important to note that Russian generals, if you just go out into social media, we're talking about General Gerasimov coming to this Izium corridor here, essentially coming to take charge and lead that effort. They're then gathering in large formations. A reminder, these Russian forces are operating in occupied Ukraine. There's lots of human sources in this area that can help the Ukrainian military as well in terms of targeting, plus the advance of those weapons that are coming in. If there's anything I would note, just big picture as we zoom back out across this entire area, what I would say is this. For every one of these axes that you see the Russians trying to advance on, they're starting to get stymied. Separately, they're taking heavy casualties here, and the Ukrainian military is pushing in. 1, 3, and 5. That's what we'd say in the military. Look at those classes of supply: food, fuel, and ammunition. The Russians, I think, are in trouble. They're having a hard time resupplying forward. The Ukrainian military as well. There's not been oil, gasoline, anything really coming into this area, and they lack the transport. So it's going to be a battle of logistics here in the next 2 to 3 weeks.
You know, Clint, over the past couple of weeks, you've done such a great job at the board, and you've helped us get into the minds of the Russian generals, the Russian strategists, about what they've wanted to do. Several times they've wanted to either move troops from the south and then from the north to meet in the middle to cut off the Ukrainians. It seems like every morning that you're here, we're talking about what they've tried to do, and yet it seems they've accomplished very little, especially, of course, up in Kyiv, which is all blue now, but even in the Donbass, where we were expecting them to move much more quickly. Have they made any progress over the past 2-3 weeks?
Very limited, Joe. In some of these places here, I'll see if I can zoom in on Izium. Izium is where you do see some advances here, but we're talking small. This isn't enough to really change the shape of the battlefield. Separately, even when they make the advances, they're doing slower movements. They're coordinating their forces. But as they coordinate, this provides time, essentially, for the Ukrainians to resupply and readjust. I think the last big thing is they are just using a lot of dumb indirect fire weapons. And dumb by, I mean, not precision guided. And the belief, I think, across the board is they're running out of those precision guided munitions. And remember, sanctions will take hold. A lot of the components they need to make tanks, to make missiles, to make aircraft. Last thing I would note is they have not used their aircraft successfully because they were flying too low. You might remember the first weeks of the war, we saw 100 aircraft or more essentially shot down by Ukrainian anti-aircraft. If they can't get in here and target in a very direct way and really bring their air power to bear with their ground forces, they're going to really struggle, and the Ukrainian military is going to continue to do well.
You know, Mike Barnicle, the expectations for the Russian military have been, from the beginning, have overestimated their abilities. Of course, first up in Kyiv, we kept seeing that long convoy expecting it to go in and crush Kyiv. We heard that time and time again. It just never happened. Then they relocated back east, going into the Donbass. But Clint just said something fascinating, because what we heard, and it makes a lot of sense. In open spaces and open fields that are more like Kansas instead of urban landscapes, you would think that would benefit the Russians. But now, what are we seeing? As Clint brings up, there are a lot of people, a lot of Ukrainians in occupied territory that are now actually sympathetic towards the Ukrainian cause. They may not have been sympathetic toward the Ukrainian cause 2 or 3 months ago. But the Russians, especially Vladimir Putin, have made so many Ukrainians, even in these occupied territories, more sympathetic towards the Russians. What does that mean? When there's troop movements, the Ukrainians are hearing about it, and we see a general go out, stick his head out there to try to help on the front lines in the east, and what happens? He and everybody else around him gets bombed. So now it even seems these open spaces are targets that really make the Russians a bit more vulnerable than we would have expected even 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, you're right, Joe. I mean, we're watching every day that Clint is on the board and talking about this, is the daily diminishment of the Russian army. It's an exhausted army. It's an ill-prepared army. It's practically a leaderless army in terms of commanders. They don't have colonels and majors and captains the way the American army does out in the field, so they have to bring in generals from Moscow. But Clint, one of the things that seems to be critical here, and maybe you can talk about it a bit, is the lack of targeting and the lack of intelligence that the Russians seem to have in terms of resupplies, American resupplies of weaponry throughout Ukraine. We're getting massive amounts of weaponry into that country flawlessly.
Yeah, and Mike, I think one of the things that's most interesting is the U.S. and its NATO partners can get supplies to the border of Ukraine faster than the Russians can get supplies into Ukraine to their own troops, which just demonstrates the power of the U.S. military. We've seen it all the way since World War II. Logistics is what really puts the U.S. above any of its adversaries' technology as well. When you look at these supply lines here, Belgorod is essentially this lane here down to Izium, where the Russians are focusing in terms of the resupply. You noticed probably 3 weeks ago there were helicopter attacks on the oil resupply there. You've had rear area attacks inside Russia on Russian manufacturing and resupply. That's very unusual to see. And even on this corridor in Izium, now as we see the Ukrainians advancing, they're going to try and take this line of supply and communication. If the Russians can't hold on to those, they're in a dire state. The other part that's just really remarkable is in this area here, they're just using indirect fires. They're not really coordinating with their aircraft, and they're not advancing in a very aggressive way. And every day they don't advance, every day they can't finish off that steel factory that Willie was talking about down here in Mariupol. They cannot move troops back here to Donetsk. If they can't move them, every day is a victory for the Ukrainians in terms of resupply and moving those Western weapons into the eastern part of Ukraine.